What if the moment you failed God most was actually the moment your faith story truly began? There is a quiet lie that many believers carry without ever saying it out loud, that real faith should make failure rare. That if you love God enough, pray enough, and mean it enough, you should never crumble under pressure. But the Bible tells a very different story, and one of its most important chapters involves a man who walked beside Jesus himself for 3 full years. This man witnessed miracles firsthand, swore loyalty with total sincerity, and still failed in the most public and painful way imaginable at the exact moment it mattered most. His name was Peter, and his story is not a cautionary tale about weak faith. It is a case study in what happens to strong faith under real pressure and what God does with it afterward. Before looking at the failure, you need to understand who was failing. Peter, originally named Simon, was a Galilean fisherman, one of the very first people Jesus called to follow him, as recorded in Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 20. He was not a religious scholar or a temple official. He was a working man, blunt, impulsive, the kind of person who spoke before he thought things through. Yet Peter was also one of the 3 disciples Jesus kept closest present, at moments the others never witnessed, including the Transfiguration, recorded in Matthew 17, verses 1 and 2. And it was Peter who, when Jesus asked his disciples who they believed he truly was, gave the answer that changed everything. He declared that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, as written in Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. That declaration was significant enough that Jesus responded by giving Simon a new name, Peter, meaning rock, and describing him as foundational to the church that would follow in Matthew 16:18. This was not a man coasting on second-hand belief. Peter had earned every reason to trust that he would never abandon his teacher. Now, to truly understand what happened next, you need to understand the setting and the weight of what was already in the air. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus shared a final meal with his disciples, what your tradition calls the Last Supper. The atmosphere in that room was heavy. Jesus had already spoken about betrayal, about departure, about things that were coming that none of them fully understood. Then Jesus turned directly to Peter with a warning. He said that Satan had asked to sift the disciples like wheat, but that he had prayed for Peter specifically so that his faith would not fail. And he told Peter that once he had turned back, his responsibility was to strengthen the others. Luke chapter 22, verses 31 and 32. Peter's response was immediate and full of conviction. He told Jesus he was ready to go to prison and even to death for him. Luke 22, verse 33. Jesus' reply was not vague. It was precise, naming the exact number of times and the exact signal that would confirm it. Before the rooster crowed that very night, Peter would deny even knowing him 3 times. Luke chapter 22, verse 34. Matthew, Mark, and John all record versions of the same exchange, meaning at least 4 independent accounts preserved this moment as too important to leave out. Here is what you need to sit with. Peter was not lying when he made his promise. He believed it with everything he had. Sincerity is not the same thing as capacity. And the gap between those 2 things is exactly where most people's failures live. Later that night, in the Garden of Gethsemane, a detachment of soldiers and temple guards arrived to arrest Jesus. Peter's first instinct was aggressive loyalty. He drew a sword and struck one of them, cutting off the man's ear, recorded in John chapter 18, verse 10. Jesus told him to stop and healed the injury. Peter was not a coward by nature. Moments before, he was willing to fight armed men alone in the dark. What was about to be tested was something different, entirely his willingness to be publicly identified with Jesus once the fighting ended and the real danger set in. Jesus was taken to the high priest's residence, and Peter followed at a distance, making his way eventually into the courtyard, as John 18, verses 15 and 16 record. This is the setting for everything that follows, not a battlefield, but a fire in a courtyard, surrounded by servants and guards on a cold night, deep inside enemy territory. The first challenge came from a servant girl who recognized Peter as one of Jesus' followers. Peter denied it flatly, John 18, verse 17, and Matthew 26, verses 69 and 70. A short time later, someone else made the same accusation. And again, Peter denied it. Luke's account, noting this time the challenge came from a man in Luke 22, verse 58. The third accusation came about an hour later, and it was the most specific. Someone identified Peter by his accent, noting clearly that he was a Galilean, in Matthew 26, verse 73, and Luke 22, verse 59. This time, Peter did not deny it quietly. Matthew chapter 26, verse 74, records that he began calling down curses on himself and swore under oath that he did not know the man. And at that exact moment, a rooster crowed. Luke adds a detail that turns this from a plot point into something devastating. At that moment, Jesus, who had already been taken inside for questioning, turned and looked straight at Peter. Luke 22, verse 61. Peter remembered the warning. He walked away from that courtyard and wept bitterly. Luke chapter 22, verses 61 and 62. This was not Peter choosing sin the way David chose adultery. This was not a deliberate act of rebellion like the Israelites, turning to idolatry in the wilderness. This was a man who had just fought to defend Jesus, with a sword collapsing under the specific pressure of fear and self-preservation in exactly the way he had sworn he never would. And that is precisely what makes Peter's failure so useful for your own life if you are honestly trying to follow God. Most people don't fail because they stopped at caring about God. They fail in the moment when caring costs something real, a relationship, a reputation. Their physical safety and fear outrun conviction. Peter's failure was not a failure of belief. It was a failure of nerve under a threat that felt immediate and deeply personal. That specific combination, real faith colliding with real fear, is something almost every Christian will recognize from their own experience. Even if your stakes look completely different, it's also worth noting how public and repeated this failure actually was. Not one private lapse, but 3 separate denials, escalating from a simple statement to an oath sworn with curses. The Gospels don't soften this. All 4 of them record it in detail, refusing to hide Peter's shame behind polished silence. That choice to preserve this story, rather than quietly omit it to protect its most prominent leader, says something important about how the earliest Christian communities understood failure. Failure wasn't something to be hidden. It was something to be told honestly, because what happens next matters more than the failure itself. Peter does not disappear from the story after the denials. Weeks later, after the resurrection, Jesus appears to the disciples at the Sea of Galilee. In the scene recorded in John chapter 21, Jesus asks Peter 3 times whether Peter loves him, a number that mirrors the 3 denials with unmistakable intention. Each time, Peter answers yes. Jesus responds with a charge to feed his sheep, to take care of his flock. John 21, verses 15 through 17. This was not a private absolution. It happened in front of the other disciples, publicly restoring the man who had publicly failed, in front of the same community that knew the full story. And it did not end with forgiveness alone. It ended with Peter being handed responsibility, entrusted with the very people Jesus cared about most. The man who denied Jesus 3 times became the same man who stood up before thousands in Jerusalem and preached the first great sermon of the early church, Acts chapter 2, verses 14 through 41. That trajectory matters. Failure was not the end of Peter's story, and it was not treated as permanently disqualifying. It became the foundation for a deeper, tested faith, one that had already proven it could break completely and still be rebuilt. So if you are trying to live a righteous life and keep failing anyway, saying things you regret, avoiding conversations you know you should have, caving when you meant to stand firm, hear this clearly. Peter's story is not there to make you feel better about the failure. It's there to correct a false assumption that failure under pressure is evidence your faith was never real. Peter's faith was real before the courtyard, and it was real after it. What changed was not his sincerity. What changed was his understanding of his own limits and his experience of a grace large enough to restore him fully rather than sideline him permanently. The pattern in this story, conviction, failure, grief, restoration, is not unique to Peter. It is one of the most consistent patterns in all of Scripture. A faith that never fails and never needs restoring is simply not the kind of faith most people actually have, and the Bible never pretends otherwise. Peter's story gives you permission to be honest about the gap between who you're trying to be and who you are in your worst moments without treating that gap as the final word on your faith. Because the story does not end in the courtyard. It never did.